Welcome to Natural Habitat Adventures Daily Dose of Nature, Wildlife Attacks, How They Happen and How to Avoid Them, presented by wildlife biologist Aaron Bott. Thank you for being here today, Aaron. I'm going to hand things off to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you everyone for tuning in. Hopefully you're able to hear me loud and clear. I know that this is a topic of interest for a lot of us, especially if we're enthusiastic recreationists that like to get outdoors. I hope to leave some time for questions at the end, so feel free to type those in and send them to Kendall as they come to you, and I'll try and get to as many of them as possible at the end of this presentation. But without further ado, let's dive into it. So a really quick introduction about me. I work as a wildlife biologist, and my primary focus is large carnivores. I work with the Yellowstone Wolf Project, studying and researching wolves up in the Yellowstone ecosystem, as well as bear and cougar work for state agencies. It's a pleasure of mine to work with these incredible animals, species that are charismatic and evoke a lot of emotion, good and bad sometimes. I have the opportunity to not only help protect these animals, but process them and research them, and that way we can learn to better coexist with them as a human species. We'd like to share the world with these incredible parts of the ecosystem. I am happy today to talk to you about wildlife conflicts, particularly aggressive conflicts here in North America, most predominantly. That's my field of expertise. The large carnivore guild that we have in the Northern Rocky Mountains, where I'm from, includes grizzly bears, gray wolves, cougars. Those are your large carnivores, your apex predators. But we also have other mesopredators or mesocarnivores as well, which includes black bears, coyotes or coyotes, wolverines, bobcats, and lynx. It's incredible to be in an area of the continent where we have a full suite of these carnivores. Unfortunately, in this modern age, many of our carnivores have been reduced in habitat and range to just fractions of areas where they used to live. Many of us, though, if you're tuning in from the United States, are familiar with black bears. I'll get around to that in a little bit. Black bears have a wide dispersal range across the North American continent. And so wherever you're at, wherever you're tuning in from, you should be at least slightly familiar with large carnivores in your neck of the woods. Cougars are also a species that have a vast range throughout the West, and they're continually expanding into the East as well. Of course, wildlife attacks are very rare. It's not common to hear of wildlife attacks. In fact, it's miraculous, I would say, as a biologist, to recognize just how few attacks there are. We as humans have physiological advantages over some situations, but if you're to take us naked out in the woods, we're not going to do very well against a 500-pound grizzly bear or a pack of wolves, each 100 pounds. Therefore, I find it remarkable that so few negative encounters do take place. That being said, occasionally they do happen. And wildlife attacks are not restricted just to the carnivore guild. In fact, in North America, the most common species of conflict that we have, human and wildlife related, is the moose. We have a lot of moose encounters that can go poorly. But there's also deer encounters that, believe it or not, go poorly, as well as elk and other ungulate or hoofed animal species. But today we're going to be talking about carnivores and the conflicts that we might have with a carnivore. So the first question I often get asked when I'm out in the Yellowstone area or the Rocky Mountains and visitors want to go exploring, they want to go backpacking, the first thing they usually ask me is, am I going to be eaten, or something to that extent? What are the dangers of me backpacking? Is it possible for me to run into a grizzly bear? Questions of that nature. And the short answer is you're probably not going to get eaten. Again, wildlife encounters on a negative basis are very rare. It's highly unlikely that you're going to be attacked by a grizzly. It's less likely that you'll be attacked by a wolf, which is probably the least dangerous of our carnivore species here in North America. But it's good to be prepared. And it's also very honest for us to recognize that, again, these animals are powerful and they are potentially dangerous. I found this chart here on the internet when I was preparing my presentation, and I thought it was pretty hilarious, so I wanted to stick it on here. Again, the risk of being attacked by an animal is small, but it also depends on the type of activities that you participate in and where you live. So here in this comical chart, we can see that if you're out on Neptune or if you're on the planet Mercury, there is literally no risk of being attacked by a grizzly bear. However, if you're on planet Earth, the risk can be a lot higher than if you're on Saturn or Neptune or Mercury. This does come into play in talking about wildlife activity or wildlife attacks. We have to decide what level of risk we as individuals are willing to take when we go out recreating in the woods. Really quickly, just so everyone understands the obvious, wolves, bears, cougars, these animals are carnivores, and the definition of a carnivore is an animal that feeds on flesh. So in order to survive, carnivores must kill and eat other animals. This isn't always pretty, and for this very reason, humans and carnivores have had a conflict over millennia. Humans, of course, are a part of the ecosystem. We kill and eat other animals as well. But historically, we've had some negative confrontations in our evolution with these other species. This is a great quote that I always like to share from a large carnivore conservation book. Despite being biological entities, large carnivores are almost entirely represented as symbols and emotions. We respond not so much to the carnivores themselves as to our own ideas of these creatures. I've given several natural habitat presentations over the last few months talking about wolves, talking about grizzly bears, talking about cougars, and I encourage you, if you have more questions about the biology of those species or the ecology of those species, to go and look those up. But time and time again, I'll emphasize that the reality of our modern world is it's unlikely that most people are going to encounter a large carnivore. Most people will never see a wolf in their lives. Most people are not going to run into a grizzly bear while they're hiking. Nevertheless, we have this in the recesses of our mind, of our genetics, of our biological makeup. We have these opinions and these ideas that come forth about carnivores, about other species, but especially carnivores and what they mean to us. And in some cases, they demand awesome respect, and in other cases, they can be quite terrifying. Again, conflicts with large carnivores and people are as old as humanity. We've had conflicts for millennia, oftentimes, of course, around agrarian practices. When we ranch, when we have livestock, these carnivores can threaten our economy, but occasionally they can threaten us as well. According to the National Park Service, the odds of being attacked by a bear are 1 in 2.1 million. We often hear these statistics. You are more likely to die in a car crash. You're more likely to die from a falling piano. You're more likely to die from a bee sting than you are from a grizzly bear attack. I think my audience, the people who I'm presenting this to today, realize that. We all understand that there's a lot of hysteria around wildlife attacks. They're uncommon, but nevertheless, my purpose today is to talk about those unlikely situations where if you were to encounter an aggressive animal, what should you do? How should you handle that situation? So although it's highly unlikely that you'll be attacked by a wild animal, we need to also recognize and remember that certain activities can increase the risk of dangerous confrontations. I have never been to the ocean. I'm a Rocky Mountains kid through and through. As such, the possibility of me being killed and eaten by a great white shark is basically zero. I'm not going to run into a great white shark that's going to eat me on my commute home from work. But the odds of me being attacked and killed by a grizzly bear are much higher than someone who has never been in grizzly bear habitat or never plans to go into grizzly bear habitat. As a biologist, I spend a lot of time backpacking on my own in grizzly bear habitat, looking for these animals, trying to be quiet, basically breaking all of the rules. So my own level of risk that I'm willing to accept is a lot higher than other people's. And that's something to remember. So when you hear these statistics of you're more likely to die from a vending machine killing you than from a wolf, that's great, and that's fun, and that's cute, and it's also very likely for most people. But if you live in dangerous wilderness country, your level of risk is going to be a lot higher, and the activities you participate in are going to be obviously a lot higher. So those are things to be considerate of. So it's best to be smart and be prepared. Now I'm going to jump back into history just for a second and talk a little bit about the realities versus the hysteria of wildlife attacks, carnivore attacks. Where do these stories come from? Is there any truth to these stories? We hear about fairy tales with little girls being gobbled up by wolves or their grandmas being gobbled up by wolves. We hear these horrific stories and accounts of frontiersmen and women who encounter cougars and bears. Is there any factual basis for these stories that we're familiar with? And the simple answer is yes, there is a factual basis for some of the stories that we're familiar with. Most horrifically, in my opinion, are wildlife encounters where the animal is sick or rabid, when the animal has rabies. If you're not familiar, and it's possible that you're not familiar with how rabies works and what it is, I'm going to give you a little bit of a refresher. Fortunately, in our modern world, we've extirpated it, or we've really crunched down on the spread of rabies throughout the world. But rabies is a deadly virus that attacks the central nervous system of mammals, typically transmitted from the saliva of an infected animal. This disease infects the brain and ultimately causes death. It's considered one of the most lethal and dangerous viruses that we know of. Rabies is horrifying. If you have read To Kill a Mockingbird, you remember when Atticus shoots the rabid dog when it comes into town, and the horror and the suspense that all the characters in the book feel when they first see that dog. Or if you've read or watched Old Yeller, you remember the heartbreak of the boy losing his dog to rabies. Rabies historically has impacted populations of animals and people across the globe. In fact, as of 2016, only 14 people have ever been known to survive rabies after they've been infected and have shown symptoms. So rabies, basically, if you get rabies or if you've been exposed to rabies, you need to immediately go to a doctor, or if you think you've been exposed, you need to immediately go to a doctor and be vaccinated. If you start to show symptoms, it's too late. You'll die. And wildlife, dogs in particular, canids, wolves, they have historically shown rabies in their populations at quite high and alarming numbers in different regions. So when you hear about wildlife attacks historically, it's probable that rabies was a factor. And of course, rabies causes all sorts of maladies in the inflicted animal. They become fearless, more or less. They salivate, they become aggressive, they'll attack anything, they're unpredictable. And it is something to be horrified of. And I think that we can speculate that a lot of our stories about werewolves, about vampires, comes from rabies. Officially, even today, over 50,000 people die of rabies every year around the world. So rabies is a horrific thing that we are still battling today. But thanks to Louis Pasteur in 1885, he created the first vaccination against rabies, and because of this vaccination, today we're spreading, or we're administering mass oral vaccinations to wildlife all over the world. So the amount of rabies positive species across the globe has radically dwindled. Thank goodness, because we have since come up with a vaccination. This vaccination, again, is a preemptive vaccination. So we're trying to catch animals, and we're trying to catch people that have been exposed to rabies before any symptoms are shown. And so today, with raccoons and skunks and bats and fox in North America, those are our primary species that have been known to carry rabies, and we're still fighting rabies aggressively all over the world. Now, setting that aside, there are still also things to consider about wildlife attacks or large carnivore attacks. And I'm using wolves here as an example because wolves are common, and also cougars are endemic to North America and South America and Central America. Grizzly bears, although they are a whole Arctic species, wolves are more populous, and so we're going to stick with wolves here. So throughout history, there have been a lot of documented attacks by wolves on people. And one example, this very thorough research paper that was published in 2017 examined 483 wolf attacks recorded from 1814 to 1861 in Europe. That's a lot of attacks. So what is happening? Are all of those valid? Are all of those credible? Well, the researchers believe that most of them were. Again, Russia is a large area. But what has changed, and why aren't we having or hearing about aggressive wolf encounters here? We haven't had a fatality in the lower 48 states since the wolf reintroduction in the mid-90s. What's the hysteria? What's the histrionics of these situations? Well, the researchers looked at these historical encounters, and they recognized that a number of these attacks were by rabid animals. They were by rabid lone wolves. Typically, these rabid attacks took place in the winter. From a general ecological perspective, wolves are generally fat and happy and healthy in the winter because all of their prey species are struggling. So wolves do well in the winter. Flipping that over, all of the documented attacks that took place in the summer were predatory attacks. They were not the attacks of a rabbit or a sick animal. They were intentional predatory attacks by wolves on people. But I'd like to point out this bottom emboldened bullet that I have here, that nearly all victims of predatory attacks, 99%, were children under the age of 15. So when we have to consider wolf attacks or bear attacks and cougar attacks, we have to recognize that children are much more vulnerable than adults. And that's something that I take seriously because I live in large carnivore country and I work outside all the time, but I'm also a father and I am concerned about my children. And I think that it's not at all ridiculous or ought to be criticized if you take protection of your children seriously when you're out and about in the woods, when you know there are large carnivores around. To continue this discussion in this research paper, they came up with the conclusion that nowadays the frequency of wolf attacks on humans, and again, I can apply this to any number of carnivores, it doesn't have to be just wolves, but the frequency of wolf attacks on humans has decreased worldwide primarily for the following reasons. Non-human prey of the wolf is more abundant. So during the 19th century, we had a great decrease or decline in native ungulate populations, especially here in North America with the bison slaughter and the elk slaughter, etc. The distribution of rabies is more efficiently controlled. There's reason number 2. And 3, children are less often used as shepherds. So again, jumping back one slide, nearly all victims of predatory attacks, 99%, were children under the age of 15 in rural areas where they were responsible for being outside all day tending flocks, and they were alone and in danger of being picked off by predators. The probability of predation as a cause of human death today in a modern world is minuscule. It is so incredibly rare. When it does happen, it makes national news, if not global news. The risk of having predation be the cause of a human death is, however, increasing as humans and large carnivores overlap. Large carnivores are not generally out to eat people. My wife and I just read the book Jaws. People like the idea of having monsters in the world. We like the idea of being consumed by something, whether it's the boogeyman or a great white shark. Nevertheless, these predations very rarely occur. Animals aren't out risking their necks to try and eat us because we are, in fact, dangerous as a species. That being said, occasionally attacks do happen, and we can expect them to, the rate of encounters to increase as the global population of humans continues to grow. And I'll talk about that just in a second, but we have had in North America in the last 2 decades, we've had, unfortunately, multiple attacks by cougars on people and fatalities, as well as grizzly bears and even a couple of wolf-human conflicts that have led to human mortality. Really quick, I'm going to talk about grizzlies and wolves and cougars and their population and their range so that we can understand where they're at and where the odds are of us interacting with them. So grizzly bears, Ursus arctos, they're a whole Arctic species. They live basically, or used to at least live everywhere in the northern hemisphere. Today, their range is greatly reduced in the lower 48 states. We have them in pretty much just a handful of designated recovery areas. This is a map of the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. These populations are growing, fortunately. The grizzly was listed as a threatened species in 1975, and today it's been suggested that the grizzly bear be delisted by biologists. Grizzly bear habitat and occupancy, as you can see in this map, has increased by 48%. So grizzlies are growing in number and their population is expanding. The gray wolf, Canis lupus, again, and whole Arctic species, they live everywhere in the northern hemisphere. Their range was greatly reduced. Nevertheless, wolves, provided with good habitat, are very prolific. They are extremely good at breeding and raising young. So populations can increase at mean rates of as much as 20% per year. So wolf populations are recovering. They're doing great. We've reintroduced them into the lower 48 states back in the 90s. And the wolf populations we can expect will continue to expand and grow. Cougar populations, similar success story. The cougars are, in fact, the only large cat species in the world with an expanding population and range. Isn't that incredible? Tigers and lions, their populations are shrinking. Meanwhile, cougars are growing in number. In fact, today we have an estimated 30,000 cougars in the American West, which biologists estimate is the same number that we had when Lewis and Clark came out west. So our cougar population is fully recovered in the West. So more wildlife plus more people equals more interaction. The human population, I don't even need to talk about. It's growing. And not only that, but we are seeing hyperdevelopment of urban areas all across the country, all across the northern Rocky Mountain region. And as more people get out and about, and as wildlife populations continue to recover, thankfully, we can expect there to be more encounters. Today, we have one of the most abundant and diverse carnivore populations we have had in the last 130 years. That's fantastic. But as our species continue to grow in number, in population, we can see an increase of predators and humans encountering one another. This is not an uncommon news article anymore or headline anymore. We see cougars in towns, around neighborhoods. I work for state wildlife agencies, and I'm sure that some of you probably saw a couple weeks ago a young man who encountered a cougar while he was hiking in Utah, and it was my responsibility as a wildlife representative here to handle that situation, which is what inspired me to to propose we talk about this presentation, talk about these issues. So as people and humans continue to expand in number, what activities and behaviors are we as a species willing to change in order to remain safe and in order to have these species on the landscape? I deal a lot with wolves. I work a lot with wolves. I did my graduate work, as I mentioned, with wolves up in the Yellowstone area, and I'm a prospective PhD candidate working on wolves and their behavior and coexistence with humans up in the Yellowstone area still. I hear a lot of negative feedback about wolves. There's a lot of people who don't like wolves, but the best argument that I ever hear is that wolves are tough to live with, and that's true. Wolves require a lot of land, just like grizzly bears and mountain lions. And because they are dangerous, people who live in areas where grizzlies and wolves and cougars inhabit have the concern of encountering these animals on a bad day. And I can respect that. So what do we need to do as a species to be proactive and to protect these animals? If we want to have grizzlies, then we need to be prepared to coexist with grizzlies. It takes two to tango. So these are some tips that I'm going to talk about with different species to hopefully answer some of those questions. But if you go into a national park, national parks have rules or regulations that say you need to be at least 75 feet or 25 yards from all wildlife, all large wildlife. If you have the animal approach you or diminish that gap, you need to maintain it. So you need to back up. You need to give elk, bighorn sheep, deer room to be natural without encroaching upon their territory and making them feel threatened, or worse, habituating them to the human presence wherever possible. In national parks, for large carnivores, it's different. It's 100 yards for all bears, cougars, and wolves. And in this picture, it also recommends moose, which I totally agree with. Again, moose, when I'm out backpacking by myself doing research, I am way more scared of moose than I am of grizzly bears. And that doesn't mean that I'm not respectful of grizzly bears and their power. It just means that I'm also very respectful of moose and the amount of power that they have. Even though parks regulate and enforce this policy of maintaining a distance from wildlife, you should do it wherever you go. It doesn't matter if you're in a national park or not. It doesn't matter if you're in a national forest or wherever you're at. You should always maintain a large distance between you and wildlife, but especially large carnivores. And again, if the animal gets near you and shrinks that distance, then you need to maintain that distance. You need to expand and walk away. This is from the British Columbia Conservation Foundation, but it's a graph that I really like that talks about black bear attractants between 2014 and 2018, and the documented reports of what attracted black bears into areas where people were over a 4-year span. You've got gut piles at the bottom made by hunters. You've got agricultural crops there at the bottom. You've got bird feeders going up the list. And then at the top of the list, you have garbage. And look at how impactful garbage can be to black bears, how much of an attractant garbage can be to bears. And the more you are open to attracting bears, the more problems you are going to have. Last night, actually, I was responding to a black bear in a residential area that was eating a guy's beehives. And so we had to go out and set a trap to capture and relocate this black bear. But again, if we are going to live in areas where we have black bears or cougars or wolves, etc., we need to be proactive, and we need to make sure that we can mitigate any type of habituation that would quickly lead to a problem. These are wild animals. We want them to stay wild. We do not want them to be habituated. So to predator-proof your neighborhood, it might take some sacrifices. We need to keep our pets inside at night, for example. We need to keep our garbage, locked up so that bears can't get into it. we need to watch and monitor our children. If we want to coexist with these large animals, we need to be responsible. We should fortify our gardens, our orchards, our fruit trees. Don't put bird feeders out. Don't feed wildlife. Carry deterrents, perhaps, depending on where you're at, and realize that occasionally conflicts are inevitable because your neighbors might not adhere to all of these sensible recommendations. Now, I'm going to jump into some more specifics here, and I'm going to talk about mountain lions, and I'm going to talk about bears. As I mentioned before, wolves are our least dangerous large carnivore in North America. Statistically, you compare negative interactions with wolves and people compared to negative interactions with bears or mountain lions and people, and the conflict rate is just so low that there's not much that I could say about wolves and humans that wouldn't be touched on or isn't going to be touched on by my bullet points with cougars and with bears. So you can apply a lot of these same concepts with wolves, but really we're going to talk here about negative encounters and reducing the chances of negative encounters with mountain lions or cougars really quick. Mountain lions, pumas, cougars, whatever you want to call them, they are the same species. I showed you on the map that they have a large population in the American West. It's my responsibility, again, as a biologist, to respond to wildlife encounters of a negative kind of attacks. Unfortunately, I have to respond to when people are attacked too, by bears or by lions. And so these are some of the tips that we share with the public as wildlife professionals, and these are tips that I would share with you in hopes that you'd remember them, especially if you live in cougar country. So lions are most active during the hours before and after dark. That's when your odds of encountering a mountain lion are greatest. So I would avoid those dusk and dawn times if I'm going to go out and recreate. Whenever I'm going out hiking, I would be in a group. If I'm going to run, I'd run in a group. Make sure that you are not as vulnerable as possible. Again, children, unfortunately, are the epitome of vulnerability. So keep your children close. Don't let them run off in front of you. Don't let them go hiking out on their own. Keep them by you. Take it seriously. It's such a tragedy when a child is injured or killed by a wild animal. It's not the publicity that the wildlife needs, and it's also unfortunate for the child who doesn't know better, perhaps. You can also carry bear spray or an air horn or some form of pepper spray to deter cougars. It doesn't just work on bears, it can work on cougars as well. Air horns can spook the animal, so I'd encourage you to carry that if you're in formidable cougar country. Don't use headphones or earbuds that will block out the natural sounds around you. You need to have all of your senses. You need to be alert. You need to know what's going on. And putting in headphones and going out at dusk or dawn in the dark alone not only will keep you safe from wildlife predators, but it can also protect you from the human predators as well. So it's good advice to follow. Also, don't wear hoods or hats that are going to obscure your view of your surroundings. You need to be aware again of what's happening around you. If you see a lion, which is unlikely because of how secretive they are, but if you do see a lion, stay calm. Call your children to you. Place yourself between the lion and the children, or better yet, pick up your child. Don't allow the lion to act curiously. Lions are particularly secretive, as I already mentioned, but they sometimes will show signs of habituation where they're not afraid of people, in which case you need to be on guard. Speak, yell, make noise. Show the animal that you are not afraid of it. If you show signs of being intimidated, if you turn your back on the animal, if you run on the animal, it's going to spark that predator instinct, and it's very likely that the animal will pursue you. So never run from a cougar. Don't turn your back on it. Don't even bend down. Stand up tall, look big, look formidable, yell at it, swear at it. I'm pretty sure that your mom will be okay if you're swearing at a mountain lion that's aggressive to you. She'll forgive you. So if attacked, fight back. Your life depends on it. If an animal, and this applies to bears as well, but if a cougar attacks you, it is planning on killing you. It is planning on negating the threat that you pose. So you need to fight back like your life depends on it. Fight back, jab its eyes, stab it with a pen, stab it with a knife, do anything you can to get that animal off of you. If the animal retreats, then you also need to retreat as safely and as quickly as possible without becoming vulnerable. Again, don't turn your back on it and don't run. Get help immediately. There is a debate about dogs and mountain lions. People like to take their dogs out on hikes with them. Unfortunately, small to medium-sized dogs are an attractant to mountain lions. If you're out in the neighborhood, or if you're up in the trails, and you know that mountain lions are around, your small dog, your medium-sized dog, can look like dinner to a mountain lion. It can look like dinner to coyotes as well. Large dogs have a bit of a flip side to it, though. Large dogs are more likely to chase off a lion. They're going to intimidate the lion. They're going to threaten the lion, and more likely than not, that lion is going to retreat if you have a large dog. When I go out hiking around here, we've got lots of mountain lions where I'm at. I've got a German Shepherd, and I'm fortunate to have a dog that's well behaved. She likes to run and keep up with me all the time, but she's definitely a good addition to have along on our family walks. So these are things to remember, little tips and some facts when encountering mountain lions. People who do not act aggressively when confronted by a cougar are more likely to be attacked. So you need to act aggressive. Don't be intimidated. Show that you are not afraid of the animal. Groups of adults with small children are 6 to 4 times more likely to be attacked. Groups of small children without adults are 14 times more likely to be attacked. Those two facts, those two statistics are pretty horrifying. And again, I like to point out that for an adult to be attacked and killed by a large animal, a carnivore, the odds are very much in your favor. You're most likely not going to have a negative encounter. But historically, looking back at wildlife encounters and attacks, and from the statistics that we have today, we know that children are vulnerable. They are susceptible to wildlife attacks. Children without adults are 14 times more likely to be attacked. That's pretty horrifying. Again, as an adult, it's your responsibility to keep your children safe, or to keep the children who are with you safe. So be mindful of that. People who are active, running or biking, are also more likely to be attacked. You're moving quietly. Your back is very quickly facing the animal as you run past, and it's tempting for the animal to ambush you. Now I'm going to transition into bears. Bear encounters have a lot of parallels with cougar encounters. But for most of you, if you're in the East, you're going to want to pay attention to how to handle black bear encounters more than anything else. You don't have grizzly bears out there in the East. If you're in Maine, you don't have mountain lions necessarily if you're in the Carolinas, unless they're coming up from Florida, which is unlikely. So really quick, if you're out in the country where you know that you have both grizzly bears and black bears, so that would be in the Northern Rockies, the Yellowstone ecosystem, the Continental Divide ecosystem up by Glacier National Park, etc., then know what kind of bear you're dealing with. When you see a bear, try and identify it. These are rules of thumb. All black bears are not all black. It's a common misnomer. In fact, the scientific name for the black bear is just the American bear, Ursus americanus, which is a much better name, because often you'll see blonde black bears, you'll see cinnamon black bears. So the color is not an indicator of what species you're dealing with. I've also seen grizzly bears that are almost black. So when you're looking at your bear, try and identify it. Indications of what species you have are as follows. Grizzly bears have a large muscular hump just above the shoulders. That's useful for digging. Black bears don't have that, but depending on the angle or the activity that the bear is participating in, it could look like it has a hump. The ears on a black bear are much taller, whereas the grizzly bear has kind of a dish-shaped face with smaller ears. And then the number one indicator that is foolproof is the claws. Grizzly bears have claws that are as long as your fingers, 2 to 3 inches. Black bears have claws that are 1 inch long. Of course, if you're close enough to see the claws, then you're too close to the animal. So if you are out in grizzly bear habitat and you see a bear and you're not sure if it's a grizzly bear or a black bear, assume it's a grizzly bear. It's always safe to just assume that the bear is a grizzly bear. If you're confident that it's a black bear, then you'll behave a little bit differently, but really, if you play your grizzly bear card every time, you should be okay. So because grizzlies are more aggressive by nature, I'm going to talk about them first. Although the odds for most of you today, most of my audience, I imagine, of you encountering a grizzly bear in your backyards is pretty small. Grizzly bears historically roamed in the West. They diverged evolutionarily from black bears 60,000 plus years ago. So black bears and grizzly bears, although they're relatives, they actually behave very differently. So they're different animals, and for that reason, it's important to remember that grizzly bears are the more aggressive of the two species, and they tend to be ornery. They evolved on an open tundra-like environment where they didn't have a place to retreat, and so their instinct to fight rather than to fly away from a threat or from danger is quite high. So for that very reason, they tend to be more aggressive. I'm showing you this map here so that you can see where grizzly bears are today. So look around. I always surprise people when I tell them that they don't have grizzly bears in Colorado or New Mexico or Utah or California. You don't have grizzlies there anymore. So if you're afraid of grizzly bears, then you don't have to go and recreate where grizzly bears are. You can find other places to recreate. There's an old Russian proverb that says, if you're afraid of the wolf, stay out of the woods. And that's probably some good advice. When you are out in grizzly bear habitat, you need to avoid areas where bear activity is highest. So if it's the fall, bears are getting fat. They're going through a phase known as hyperphagia. They're preparing for winter. Stay out of the berry bushes. And if it's in June, if it's July, that's the time when the bears are getting ready to breed. So you need to be on guard and make sure that you know where the bears are going to be at. You can do this best by asking authorities about bear activity in the area. If you're going to a national park, stop at the ranger station. If you're going to the Forest Service or the National Forest, stop at a Forest Service station and say, hey, these are the places I'm going to hike. These are the places I'm going to camp. Are there known grizzly activity? Is there known grizzly activity in this area? Have people been seeing bears around here? Did an animal die out here? Are hunters out here? And have they left gut piles behind, et cetera, et cetera? So talk to the authorities, know what kind of bear activity is in the area before you go recreating. Also look for tracks, scat, and carcasses while you're out and about. If you see a lot of fresh bear scat or a lot of fresh tracks, then you can assume that a bear is in the area and you should probably retreat. You should probably get out of there. Hike in groups of 3 or more. Again, stay as a group. If you're with a group of people, the odds of you being safe are pretty great. You're gonna be fine if you're with a group. Talk loudly, make noise. The worst thing in the world you could do with a bear, a grizzly or a black bear, is surprise it, especially with a grizzly bear though. Again, grizzlies don't have really as strong of a flight instinct as they do a fight instinct. So if you surprise a bear, the bear is more likely to be aggressive to you. If you do accidentally surprise a grizzly bear, for example, if you're hiking in some alder bushes, you can't see up ahead, you're trying to make noise, but for whatever reason, the wind's not in your favor, you round the corner and there's a bear, try and diffuse the situation by reassuring the bear that you are not a threat. So talk down to the bear, not in a demeaning way, but lower your head, turn aside, talk gently, make it clear that you don't mean any harm. You're trying to, again, neutralize this confrontation that you have suddenly started. Do not run from a bear, whether it's a black bear or a grizzly bear. Grizzly bears can run 35 to 40 miles per hour. That's a lot faster than you can. And just like when a dog chases you, a bear is going to chase you. But I can guarantee you that there's going to be considerably more action when that bear catches you than when a dog would catch you. So don't run from an animal. Don't turn your back on the animal. Again, try and diffuse the tension, reassure the animal you're not a threat, and try and be as non-aggressive as possible. That's the opposite of what I told you with the cougars. Also, get your bear spray ready. You should always have a bear deterrent on you, and I'm going to talk about that for just a second. We have done a lot of research to show what tools are most effective for people to use in the backcountry when there's a possibility that they're going to encounter bears. Bear spray is basically a concentration of pepper spray in an aerosol can that can spray 30 to 40 feet for about 7 seconds. It is very powerful stuff, and it works. If you spray a bear with bear spray, the odds are you're going to be okay. People, especially macho guys around my neck of the woods, they like to say that they're going to pack some heat, they're going to bring a gun. When I go out to do bear stuff, I do have bear spray, but I also have to carry a firearm with me. But it's gotta be one heck of a gun in order to pack a punch in a bear. I have a very powerful revolver that I use really just for worst case scenarios. But the odds of you actually hitting a large animal running at you at 35 to 40 miles an hour when you encounter it at 50 feet away are minuscule. You're not gonna neutralize that threat with a firearm. You're much better off using a bear spray. You don't have to be a marksman in order to hit it. You just got to point it in the right direction and hope that it's not a really windy day. So make sure that you have bear spray on you. I know people ask all the time when they go out to Yellowstone or when they go out to Glacier National Park or Alaska or British Columbia, should I really buy bear spray? Because it's expensive. Get it. It depends on your activity. If you're just going to Yellowstone to see Old Faithful and you're gonna stay in hotels the whole time, then you're probably not going to need bear spray. If you're surrounded by 500,000 people while you're there in the park, you're gonna be okay. But if your purpose of going to Yellowstone is to hike and to backpack and to camp, yeah, you should get bear spray. It's worth the investment. Hold your ground if the bear starts to charge you. Spray the bear if it approaches you at all. Maintain your distance without turning your back on the bear. So if the bear does approach you, try and maintain a distance. Try and walk away without turning your back on the bear. Talk down to the bear. Try and diffuse the situation. If a bear does attack you, lie down, face down on the ground, and cover your head and neck and play dead. This is the thing that nightmares are made out of. It almost never happens, but because the topic of this presentation is wildlife attacks, we're going to talk about it. If a grizzly bear does charge you, if it is not a bluff charge, if it does make contact with you, if you have deployed your pepper spray, if you've done everything that you can, but the bear still ends up making contact with you, then lie down, play dead. The bear most likely just wants to neutralize the threat again. If it thinks that you're dead, if it thinks that you are no longer a threat, the odds are the bear is going to go away. In the worst case scenario, if the bear begins to consume you, if it does not go away, then you need to fight back. You need to fight back. And if you are with someone who is being attacked by a bear, then you need to do everything you can to try and help that person. Too often, especially if it's campers, people hear screaming, everyone runs away. In reality, people should run to the site to try and diffuse the situation. That rarely happens, but if you are attacked by a bear, if playing dead doesn't work, then you need to fight back as hard as you can because your life depends on it. So things to remember when you're in bear country, grizzly bear country: carry bear spray and keep it ready to use. It is not going to do you any good if it's in your backpack and you can't reach it. It should be at your hip or at your sternum strap where you can access it readily. Make noise where visibility is poor. Bear bells, those little jingly things that people sell at gift shops, those don't work. So don't buy them. They're just a gimmick. They don't work. They're not loud enough, and they blend into the natural sounds. So don't buy bear bells, but make noise, talk, sing, clap, make noise. Again, if the bear hears you coming, it's not gonna want to stick around. The bear's gonna leave. Negative encounters happen when you surprise the bear. Check again with local authorities to learn of any bear activity in the area. Be alert. Don't go hiking with headphones in. Don't go trail running in grizzly bear country. That's a really dumb thing to do. You're moving quick, you're quiet, you're on your own usually. You're doing everything that is probably wrong, and you could have a very negative encounter. If you're camping out, keep all of your food and your garbage, all of your smellables actually, that includes toothpaste and deodorant, properly stored in a bear-proof canister away from where you sleep. I'm not going to go into the details about that, because if you're planning on going camping out in grizzly bear habitat, then you should be talking with your local officials before you go anyway. You should talk to your authorities, and they can instruct you more on how to keep your campsite clean. Black bears, this is the last species I'll talk about before the end of the presentation. Black bears are Ursus americanus. Remember, black bears are not all black. Here's a map of their distribution. So people often think of raccoons and coyotes and how in the modern world they've expanded in number and their distribution and their range has expanded. It's the same with black bears. We actually have lots and lots of black bears, more black bears than probably we've ever had in North American history. Black bears just do really well coexisting with us in our backyards. So look here on this map, this crude outline showing you where there are black bears, where there aren't black bears. And it's possible that you could be in Nevada and still have black bears in certain locations. So don't think you're safe, Nevada. If you're in any one of those states where there are black bears, or any one of those provinces, then realize that you should be bear aware. You should be black bear aware. Things to remember about black bears that are different from grizzly bears is that black bears, because they're so common and because they often appear harmless and inoffensive, and they usually are, people generally kind of don't take them as seriously as grizzly bears. Black bears are less feared than the grizzly bear. That being said, the fatalities that have occurred from black bears attacking humans are many times greater than grizzly bears. Grizzly bears are ornery, sure, but there's fewer of them. Black bears seem less dangerous, and so people don't take them as seriously. If you have a black bear in your neighborhood, you need to take that very seriously. Call your state wildlife agency, get that bear out of there. You want it relocated. You don't want someone's pet to be eaten, and you don't want someone to be attacked or injured. Bears that associate humans with food can be dangerous. Again, remember, you're trying to keep animals separate from human food. If they're eating your garbage, that bear is either going to injure someone or it's going to end up dead. So keep your garbage put away. Don't feed wildlife. You shouldn't do it. It's bad. Most black bears are less aggressive than grizzly bears. They have the short claws, like cat claws. They allow them to climb trees. It's pretty easy to intimidate a black bear. So if a black bear encounters you, if it is acting aggressively, if it's huffing, if it's puffing, then you should stand your ground. It might charge at you to try and get you to turn and run, but you never run from a predator. Remember that? So don't ever run from a predator. Stand, hold your ground, and if a black bear attacks you, you fight back. Again, just like with a grizzly bear or a cougar, if you are in danger of losing your life, then you need to fight back to preserve your life. If a grizzly comes at you and makes contact, play dead. If it starts to consume you, fight back. If a black bear attacks you, you just fight back. Skip the playing dead part. Safety in the outdoors. This is just a general revisit to all of the points that we've made. No matter where you are, what kind of activities you're planning on doing, mountain biking, trail running, camping, walking, just remember to never run from a predator, to be heard, make noise. Animals are typically skittish around humans, so you want the animal to know that you are a human. Travel in groups of 3 or more. That's the safest thing you can do. That's the safest thing you can do. Travel in groups of 3 or more. Store your food properly in bear vaults or canisters. Have bear deterrents to use on cougars or moose or bears. Or human predators as well. Bear spray is an effective safety tool. And avoid hiking in the dark. As I wrap this up, I just would like to remind people that we have to be okay with the level of risk that we're willing to take. You can't go mountain biking in the Bob Marshall Wilderness area and where there's grizzly bears up in Montana, and you can't think that that's okay and that you're not going to encounter a bear. You have to be prepared and say, I'm doing something that is risky, my behavior is risky, I could encounter a bear. And if you're okay with that, if you're willing to take those risks, then move forward. That's up to you. If you're not okay with it, then don't do it. Again, to jump back to that old proverb from the Russians, if you're afraid of the wolf, stay out of the forest. That way the wolf stays safe and you stay safe as well. This is a quote from Aldo Leopold as I wrap up, that it must be a poor life that achieves freedom from fear. We have successfully seen resurgence of large carnivores in North America over the last several decades. The wolf population is doing great in many areas. The grizzly bear population is doing great in many areas. The cougar population, it's phenomenal. So as we are seeing these conservation success stories unfold, we need to realize that we're going to have to coexist with these animals, and there's a price to pay. And to be informed and respectful of large carnivores is an essential part of that coexistence. These are 3 books that I highly recommend you read if you're interested in learning more about bear and cougar encounters. These are books that I would recommend to anyone, but especially the one on the left. Stephen Herrero is considered the world's foremost ethologist studying bear attacks. He knows more about bears than just about anyone else. This book is phenomenal. It's been reprinted, I think, 3 or 4 times in several different editions since the 80s, I believe, or at least the early 90s. It is the definitive guide for encountering bear attacks. Don't let the corny title make you think that it's just a bunch of horror stories. It's a great resource. Also, the Bears Without Fear is a fantastic book, and the book that came out this year, The Cougar Conundrum, those are great resources to read. All of the authors of these books are not just Joe Schmoes. These are world-renowned biologists, and they know what they're talking about, so I recommend them. This is my final slide. So you guys made it. We've talked about an uncomfortable situation, or uncomfortable situations in the wilderness that it's very unlikely that any of us will ever encounter. But I want to remind you all that it's rational to experience fear around large predators that could potentially hurt or kill us. It's very rational to be afraid of bears and wolves and lions. But it's equally irrational to let that fear stop us from doing the things that we love. We're a part of this planet. We can coexist with these large carnivores. I know we can. It's something I'm dedicating my life to, is the coexistence of these incredible species in hopes that they will recolonize some of their historic habitat. But in order for us to coexist successfully, we need to be educated. And we also need to recognize that there is a threat with having these powerful animals in our backyards. So hopefully you learned something about our topic today, and that is that.
Thank you, Aaron. That was great. We have lots of great questions for you, so we'll take questions since it's the top of the hour for the next 10 or 15 minutes.
Sorry, guys,
and I'd
I
like
always
to
do that.
Oh, that's okay. No, this was great. You covered everything beautifully, so thank you. For those who have questions for Aaron, I just want to remind you, you can submit those in your control panel under the questions field. Okay, First question is related to what brought us to this topic in the first place, that runner in Utah who encountered the cougar. What could he have done differently?
Good question. So he actually did some pretty good things. My understanding of the situation, and if I am wrong in these facts, you're going to have to forgive me. So just bear with me. But my understanding is that he saw a cougar with kittens, and he started to video. The cougar then proceeded to act aggressively towards him, and if you've seen the video, then you know how the story goes. So he talks loud, he tries to be intimidating, and the cougar is pursuing him. During his video, he's doing everything right, everything that he could be doing. What he did wrong, and if I got these facts wrong, then I'm to blame. But if he pulled the camera out as soon as he saw the cougar and he started to video the cougar or the cougar's kittens, that was his mistake. Was it worth getting the video? Was it worth getting the footage? I don't know. I don't think it would be. If he sees a cougar, if you see a cougar, immediately stand your ground, show that you're not intimidated, and start to retreat if possible. I wouldn't hang around, that's for sure. I wouldn't hang around and see if that animal gets upset at me being there, especially with young.
All
Hopefully
right.
that answers your question.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll move on to a couple of questions about different tactics to take in terms of gear. Would a taser work, at least just for the sound of it?
I'm not aware of any official study looking at how tasers can affect wildlife, especially a bear. You can deploy bear spray again for 30 to 40 feet, and it makes a large cloud, a mist that the animal has to run through. So rather than a taser, I would endorse bear spray.
Okay. And what about flares? There's a few people who are wondering if carrying flares with them would be even worth it.
Flares can be nice. I would recommend an air horn, though. In fact, there was a study conducted up in the Yukon Territory where researchers, geologists, spent an entire season walking through bear habitat, and they were asked to deploy air horns, I think every 20 minutes or something like that. And they went the entire season without seeing a single bear. So if I saw an animal that was threatening me, if I was afraid that there is an animal nearby, I'd shoot off an air horn before I do a flare.
All right, that's a good tip. Okay, there's some questions about bears. Can you tell the difference between a black bear and a grizzly bear scat?
No, you really can't. And the reason why is you don't know how big of an animal, you don't know how big the animal was that deposited the scat. So if you have large scat, then obviously it came out of a large animal, but you can't know for sure. So if you just see fresh bear scat, you need to be on guard. Tracks are different. You can determine the species of bear by tracks, but not by scat.
Okay. Is it true that bears won't attack groups of 3 or more?
That is generally true. There has been an exception. It took place, I think it was in Alaska. Really, really bizarre situation. But if you are in a group of 3 or more, you are statistically, the odds are in your favor. 3 or more is what you should do. Interestingly enough, there's never been a documented case of a grizzly bear attacking someone on horseback either. That doesn't mean that it could never happen, but it seems like if you're gonna go out in bear habitat and if you are alone, then do what the park rangers do and ride a horse, because there's never been a documented account of someone being on horseback and being attacked by a bear.
Interesting. Okay, what should a person do if a black bear enters their home?
Good question. Unfortunately, this happens all the time, and I have to go out and respond to situations like that. What I would do is I'd close the door that separates me and the bear, and I would call my state wildlife agency immediately. You can call dispatch, and dispatch will contact the wildlife agency. Some people might, if it's a small bear, they might feel emboldened by the size of the bear. They might, try and scare the bear with a shotgun. I had a guy who shot his own house up with a shotgun trying to scare a bear out. I wouldn't recommend that. I've had people clap their hands, bang pots and pans trying to get a bear out. The safest thing to do is just seal off the room that the bear is in and call dispatch and hope that they get there before too much of your property is damaged.
Okay. And there were a couple questions. They're the same question, but different wildlife. So I'll combine them. If someone is with a person who is being attacked by either a grizzly bear or a cougar, what would you do if you were the one who was not being attacked?
If it's a cougar, I would jump in and fight that cougar off of that person as hard as I possibly could. Cougars are cats. Cats are skittish. If someone I am with is being attacked by a cougar, I would do everything I could. I would grab a stick, I would grab rocks, I would pull out a pocket knife. I'd do anything. Obviously, if it's a family member, if it's my child, then I'd do it with my bare hands. But do anything you can to give that victim an advantage over the predator that's attacking it. If it is a bear, same thing applies to a black bear as to a cougar. If it's a grizzly bear, I would do the same thing. It is more risky, obviously, with a grizzly bear. The grizzly bear might turn and attack you, but I still would do it. Your friend who is being attacked or the person who is being attacked stands no chance if that bear is intent on killing them. I personally would fight. Really quick, I'm going to make a side note, but again, if you're in a group larger than 3, it's unlikely that you'll be attacked by a bear, but it has been documented where people alone in their tents have been attacked by a bear, and while screaming for help, other campers have retreated. It is widely believed that if the other campers had not retreated, if they had grouped together and rushed the bear, they could have saved that person's life. So that's something to consider. If you're with other people, or if you can get other people to help you, and then you can charge the bear as a mob, do it. Absolutely do it.
Okay, good advice. Okay, we'll move on to a couple different wildlife species. Someone here watching said they've been told that the only wildlife animal to run away from is a moose. Is this correct?
I think that depends on the situation. I would retreat from a moose. I don't know if they're the only species to retreat from, but I would definitely retreat from a moose. The best thing you can do is play Ring Around the Rosie with a moose and run around a tree, hopefully a large tree, or a bush, or a car, or something like that. Try and get something between you and that animal.
All right. And in terms of encountering things like rabid skunks or other wildlife that are rabid, what's your advice?
Rabies is serious. Rabies is not something you mess around with. If you suspect that an animal is rabid, you should contact your state wildlife agency immediately, or just call dispatch. Again, an infected animal can infect other animals of its own kind, of a domestic variety, or people. So if you see an animal that is acting weird, typically they're solitary because no one wants to hang out with a rabid animal. So all of the animal's buddies are gonna leave. The animal's by itself. It's acting weird. It's got a lot of saliva pooling off of its teeth and its gums. If it's stumbling around, then you should immediately call dispatch or call your wildlife state agency.
Okay. And there was a question about, when you say dispatch, do you mean 911?
I do. I mean 911, because they can immediately call in the authorities that can handle that situation. Typically 911 or the police force would not respond to it, but they would get a hold of the officials who could respond to it. I also want to mention too that because rabies is so terrifying, if you have been around an animal that is weird or even not weird, if you have encountered a raccoon or something like that that wasn't acting weird and it was relocated, you should go to a doctor and consider being checked for rabies. You can only prevent rabies before the symptoms are shown, so you don't want to catch it too late.
Yeah, got that. All right, final question, and this was asked by a few people. When you're fighting back, hopefully that doesn't happen, but when you're fighting back against a bear, what is the most sensitive area?
Go for the nose. Go for the nose. You can go for the eyes too. The eyes are just small targets, but the nose and the eyes are the best thing that you can go for. If I was on the ground and I still had bear spray, I would spray it, and that goes to being attacked by, or excuse me, that goes back to seeing someone attacked by a bear. If someone's on the ground and a bear's on top of them, I would run over there and I would spray the heck out of the bear and the victim. That's a joke that I always tell my friends, and they tell me, is if I get attacked by a bear, just spray me, because I'll survive the bear spray. It'll be unfortunate and miserable, but if you're on the ground, try and deploy the bear spray. In fact, we just had a girl who was charged by a grizzly bear. The grizzly bear pinned her against the fence, and she sprayed the bear continuously at point blank, and that's what saved her life. So keep spraying that bear spray if possible. If you don't have anything, go for the nose, go for the eyes. Nose and eyes, that's where it's at.
Okay, great. Well, Aaron, this was really enlightening. I know we've all learned a lot, and so I really thank you for taking the time to present for us today. I'm going to call it there with questions and hand it back over to you for closing comments.
Thank you guys for participating. I know this is kind of a sensational topic. It's unlikely, as I've already said, but I think in reality, we can recognize that a lot of our conservation efforts are paying off. We have a growing population of large carnivores in North America. That's incredible. But we also have a growing population of people. We need to be prepared for coexistence by knowing how to handle negative wildlife encounters, and we need to protect people under our supervision as well. So if you have kids, protect those kids, take good care of them, and let's strive for a better future where we can coexist with more biodiversity. That's it.
Thank you, Aaron. Thanks again. Another wonderful presentation from you. And my thanks as well to everyone who tuned in today. Be sure to join us on Monday for our next daily dose of nature, and keep an eye out for our Sunday e-news announcement, and check our website this weekend for next week's lineup. We did record today's presentation, and we'll have the replay available on our website soon. And with that, I'll conclude the webinar. Goodbye, everybody. Have a great weekend.